Hello, and welcome to The Human Factor, the LinkedIn Live of Inc. and Fast Company. I'm Eric Schoenberg, the CEO of Inc. and Fast Company. When B school students of the future study industries disrupted in the early 21st century, they have to look at news media. The business models, my business models, went from tame and predictable to feral seemingly overnight. And the leaders who thrive in that environment are and have to be models of resilience and foresight. Which brings us to today's guest. Bob Cohn has served media's transformation with amazing dexterity, both as a journalist and as an executive. Bob's publications have always been the envy of his competitors. I know because I've been one. As an executive editor at Wired, Bob led the brand that first blurred tech and culture. Later, he grew the online audience of a once tweety Atlantic Monthly tenfold in 5 years, then vaulted into the role of Atlantic's president, overseeing all of its prolific lines of business. In January of last year, Bob became president of another storied title, The Economist, just in time for the pandemic. Maybe for once, something in the industry he didn't foresee. Now, we're lucky to be joined by Bob to talk about the state of the media industry, the future of truth, and a few other odds and ends. So welcome, Bob.
Eric, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. And thank you for that generous introduction.
Well, it's great to have you. Now, your career has been kind of like a voter's guide to the past 25 years in the evolution of news media. But let's start at the beginning. Why'd you get into this business?
You know, in fairly traditional ways, I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I went off to college and began working at the college daily during the very first week of orientation. And then somewhere along the way, I think probably during summer internships, I began to imagine that what had been a kind of an extracurricular activity might actually become a career with some of those summer jobs. And I think I got in. Well, at some point, it seemed like the course of least resistance because I was already doing it and had a bit of a leg up. But I think ultimately, what attracted me and what still makes it interesting is the opportunity just to indulge your natural curiosity, to indulge my natural curiosity, ask questions, and learn about new things. I like to write and I like to learn, and I was kind of, the ultimate generalist at that time. So it just offered. It didn't seem like work. It seemed like every day was going to be fun or interesting or both.
Well, speaking of fun and interesting, one of the early stages in your career was the Washington reporter for Newsweek during the Clinton era, which had its moments of interest and fun. I would guess somewhere between the war in Kosovo and Monica Lewinsky, there were some stories to tell. When your grandkids ask you what it was like covering the Clinton White House, what stories are you going to tell them?
Well, it was fascinating because I when you're in those days, I was at Newsweek and I was one of two White House reporters, and we covered very diligently. So in the press briefing room on Air Force One, in the press conferences, etc. And really, my job was to try to understand what the president and his people were thinking. And in those days, this was just pre-internet. This was early '90s, so I didn't have what so many people have had since, which is constant deadlines. I was working for a weekly that did not have the second gear, this other cadence of constant publishing. So it was, how do I understand the most important story of the week? And how do I get inside what they're thinking and trying to do at the White House with the president and the first lady and the people around them. So, and Newsweek was pretty well treated in those days. So you could be a fly in the wall at some things, and you'd have a weekly sit down with the chief of staff and a weekly sit down with the national security advisor. So just the inside nature of that role was fascinating, and trying to distill that back and bring it to our readers in a kind of a storytelling way was a great education for me. I did this at the last 3 years of I was at Newsweek for 10 years, and I covered the White House during the last 3 years. And prior to that, I'd covered the Supreme Court and the Justice Department. So it was a great, covering the White House was a great capstone to my kind of reporting and writing days.
Was there a moment, a kind of head slapping moment when you witnessed something or realized something you thought, God, so that's really how it works, or I can't believe he said that, or that kind of thing? That's there's a, a yarn.
Yeah, well, I think about early, I can't remember when this was, probably early on, probably 1993 or so. I was doing some reporting and I came back to the bureau chief and I said, there's a lot of stuff going on at the White House this week that people don't know about. I think that the baseball owners were in there, trying to prevent a baseball strike, and there was a foreign policy crisis at the same time. And I was picking up a lot of this kind of backstory about there's this group over in the Roosevelt room, and there's this group over in the cabinet room, and the president's doing shuttle diplomacy and trying to figure everything out. And I went back and the bureau chief said, why don't we turn this into a week inside the White House? Try to just give people a behind the scenes feel. We ended up doing a cover story called 7 Days.
Hmm.
And the moment that, and I haven't thought about this story for a while, but the moment I'm remembering is I was in a basement office with David Gergen, who was then the White House counselor, and my colleague Eleanor Klipsch. Eleanor and I were the White House correspondents, and we were getting the color we needed from Gergen about kind of what really happened that week. And his phone rings, and he picks it up, and he says, "Yeah, okay," and he says, "Come with me." And I've been on the beat maybe 3 or 4 months at this point, and we're in the basement of the West Wing. We go up some back stairs, and the place is so small. Before I know it, we're in the Oval Office with the president and Gergen and George Stephanopoulos and me and Eleanor. And George, for those of you who know him as the ABC interviewer, was a young and extremely valuable White House aide to President Clinton. So it was just like a moment ago, I was talking to Gergen in the basement, which in a room that used to be the barbershop of the White House. That they
Uh-huh.
had, real estate is so important there. They had to repurpose the swimming pool and the barbershop into office space. And the next minute, we're talking to the president. And so, uh, what I remember, the small talk was that both Eleanor and I were runners. Like to go running, and of course, he was an on again, off again runner. So we were talking about marathons for a while, and then like Stephanopoulos looks at his watch, and we say, "Okay, we got 10 minutes to figure out to get something good from the president here and understand what's happening." So just a small moment. There were a lot of overseas trips that were probably more substantively important, but that moment sticks with me because I honestly had no idea what was happening, and suddenly we show up in the Oval.
How cool is that? That's great. So just shooting the breeze with the president about running.
A little bit.
Yeah, all right. There's some perks in that job. Um, if so, so next in your resume, just to tick them all off, the industry standard, which harkens back to an era which is unimaginable now, in which the growth of the internet actually aided the magazine business, and the internet industry standard grew like crazy until it collapsed. Um,
Yeah.
it was it was sort of one of the symptoms, one of the cardinal events of the collapse of the first tech bubble. Do you see anything similar in the economy or world today? In to that kind of overheated state of affairs, cryptocurrency, or meme stocks, anything like that?
Well, a tiny bit of context. The industry standard only lasted for 3 years, as you know, but from 1998 to 2001, and it was it was billed as the News Weekly of the Internet economy. This was like Web 1.0, Amazon and Pets.com and Yahoo in the early stage, pre-social media. And I got there halfway through this 3 year run. Um, uh, the statistic, which is memorable, which goes to your question, is in the year 2000, the industry standard sold more ads than any magazine in the history of American publishing, something like 5,600 ad pages. As a weekly, you could rack up more pages because you have 52 times a year. But even so, do the math. That's more than 100 pages of ads per issue. The very next year, in the year 2001, it went bankrupt. So that's the story of the kind of whoop and wharf of what happened in Web 1.0 that we all lived through, and I ended up leaving the standard and going off to Wired from there. We'll probably get to, but I don't know that it turns out that the money was crazy because the money was going directly from venture capitalists to startups, and the startups would spend it all on parties and marketing. I'm basically on marketing, parties and advertising. It basically would, and this is why, if you look back, even in 2003, at an issue of the industry standard from 2001, and you looked at the 100 pages of ads, none of the companies existed anymore because they're all flamed out. They spent all their VC money on marketing, including a big chunk with magazines like the ones you and I worked at, and didn't go anywhere. And yet the story we were covering was real. And so I don't know that it's fair to say, some things didn't work, like pets.com, but you look now at Chewy and you say, well, okay, pets.com was ahead of its time, and maybe it didn't have the right infrastructure, and the business model wasn't right, and we didn't have next minute delivery like we have now. But a lot of those stories from 20 years ago, I mean, the coverage was overheated, but the underlying direction of travel was accurate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So story by story, or company by company, if you will, there was a lot of meringue there, but there's still substance. Yeah, I mean, after all, we do have
Yeah,
an internet, don't we?
yeah. Look at the world we live in now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you went from the Standard to Wired, which was, I thought, uh, really one of the first magazines to capture the idea that technology was a lifestyle as well as a profession, and an engineering skill. And I also thought that, in addition to reflecting the time, Wired helped create it. And I wondered if you agree with that impression that I had, and whether you think that a media property today has that kind of power.
I do. Well, I think your first observation that the main transition that occurred at Wired in those years, I was there from 2000 to 2008, is that we went from being a magazine about technology to a magazine about how technology is changing the world. And it's a small filter shift, but it opened us up. And we were a Condé Nast title that was kind of a sore thumb. It didn't fit in with the rest of Condé Nast, with with the exception of the New Yorker. Everything else was a shelter title, or a cooking title, or a women's title, and we were this odd man out in Silicon Valley, not based in New York. But when we made the shift to thinking about, this is about how technology is changing the world. We are no longer a technology magazine. We're a general interest magazine covering politics and science and sports and business and medicine, and the many ways that there's turbulence because of technology. And it opened up a whole new way to think about our jobs and the title, but to think about what was happening in the country during that first decade of the century. And I think that our shift reflected, to get to your question, what was actually happening on the ground. Is suddenly people who didn't really think about technology were using smartphones, we're ordering, we're using e-commerce, we're interacting with the internet, and obviously on email, in a way that made it all very much part of the fabric of their lives, and not some outside vertical that they could not interact with. And we tried to capture that, I think, and I think it helped to bring Wired to the next stage in its life cycle.
Is there, do you think, the possibility in in a mainstream media brand, say, just to limit the universe, to have that kind of impact, or to capture that kind of zeitgeist today? Is anyone doing it? Is it even possible?
I have to think it's possible. I mean, we used to think of ourselves as trying to be the next version of Rolling Stone. What Rolling Stone was for the culture, for popular culture, we wanted to be the next version of that, right? And that was, of course, a 70s and 80s title, and where in its heyday, at least. So I don't know if anyone's doing it. I can't think of anyone offhand. If anyone is, you have to probably look at the verticals and not at the generalist kind of horizontal titles. But is Bon Appetit capturing food in maybe 5 years ago in a different kind of way and owning that. Uh, I think there's excellent journalism out there that we all, from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to what you guys do over there and everywhere else. But is anyone really owning the subject matter? I don't. I can't think of anyone right now. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's tough. I think first of all, there needs to be that, all enveloping trend that Wired is, that the infiltration of technology into every aspect of life that Wired identified and advanced. I don't know that in this fragmented world you have that.
Yeah.
There will be something like that, and hopefully there will be smart journalists, maybe on this call, who will figure that out. So let's move on to the Atlantic then, where you were brought in to bring, speaking of digital transformation, to bring a 150-year-old kind of tweety monthly into the internet era, which you did with tremendous success. And this is a question not so much about media or editorial techniques or audience building strategies as it is about leadership. Like, what did you find when you got there, and how did you institute that change?
So I arrived there as a somewhat seasoned print journalist. My time at Wired had been basically running the print magazine. So Wired, a magazine about how digital technology is changing the world. But I was running the product I was running was print. So this was my first exposure to running a digital newsroom and to thinking about the issues of doing digital journalism on a regular basis, on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. And I would say we had some advantages that I was lucky to inherit all around us at the time. And in the next few years, there were the digital, upstarts. There was, Vice and Vox and BuzzFeed all coming along, and they had energy and they had venture capital money, and they were new. They weren't, encrusted by legacy media that was hanging on to printing presses and old ways of doing things. And that seemed like an advantage they had for many years, I think. But what I immediately saw we had at the Atlantic, and I think others saw it in their places, where we had history and we had long-standing editorial values. We knew what we stood for, and our audience knew what we stood for, and the marketplace generally knew what we stood for. And we weren't any good yet at the internet side of things, but we had an identity and a self-identity that gave us an advantage when it came to reinvention. And so I think the main thing we did, and it's clear only in hindsight, and because there was no strategy sheet to do this, but was to say, the Atlantic has been around for, at that point, 151 years when I got there, and these are its editorial and journalistic and brand values, and I just put them on a piece of paper. This part I did do. We are authoritative and provocative and intelligent and literary and witty, and try to extract all the values of the brand, which were print values, and then go over here and say, let's go build a website that is authoritative and provocative and witty and literary and intelligent. And it's going to be an authentic version of the Atlantic without just simply being the online version of the Atlantic's print publication, which we both had worked at places that set up websites and just poured their print content onto the web and called it the website. And that wasn't going to work at the Atlantic, as we were a monthly magazine and publishing long stories and medium-sized stories, maybe in a good week, in a good month, 40 stories in a month. Well, we needed to publish 40 stories in a day to be a thriving website, or at least at the outset, 15 or 20 stories a day. So we weren't going to simply be able to pour the print content into digital and say, there's theatlantic.com. So instead, this extracting the brand values and then building something that embodied those values, but that wasn't tethered to that part of the newsroom or even those teams, I think was the critical and moment, and it was essential because we didn't have enough content otherwise. So we began just very slowly building out a digital version of what the Atlantic would be if Emerson and Thoreau and Longfellow had access to the internet when they founded it in 1857. So that was a lot of fun. And as we succeeded, we got more resources and attracted bigger audiences, and it was a self-perpetuating operation. And very quickly, our business side, which I was not yet then involved with, but I was obviously interacting with closely, began building up a value proposition and a business and ad sales staff to go along with the emerging digital opportunities. So we were, I think, among the first legacy operations where the print and digital advertising crossed as far back as 2011. November of 2011 is when the Atlantic began making more money in digital advertising than print. That was partly because it was a relatively we weren't as sophisticated as we maybe should have been on print advertising. So the thing we had to hurl over wasn't quite as high as it would have been at a Condé Nast or a Time Inc. title. But nonetheless, we got all the cylinders of the engine firing on we're going to be a digital operation without ever ignoring the power of the once a month print product. So an interesting observation within that is as we began experimenting with what could be on theatlantic.com, I remember what works in our new culture and entertainment section? Well, can we do Game of Thrones recaps? Can the Atlantic do a Game of Thrones recap? And there was a lot of internal conversation. I mean, we probably only spent a little while thinking about it, but it turns out absolutely we could do that, and our audience would accept that from us, so long it was executed in a way that was consistent with Atlantic values. So the topic mattered less than the mode of execution and the delivery. And what it told me then, which is useful, is that the brand was elastic and the audience would give us a lot of license, and the constraints were more likely to be internal than external. The staff might think, oh, we can't do Game of Thrones. That's way outside our kind of mission and what we stand for. But the readers would have it if we did it the right way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept about the power of a media brand to stretch. And it's always one of the things that I've admired from a distance about The Atlantic when you were running it, was the way the brand stretched over so many different lines of business. So live events, custom content, consulting. Were all those in place when you got there, or did you see that those were places that you could expand?
A little bit of both. The when I got there, we were a print and live events business for the most part, with a fledgling digital presence. That was the reason I came, was to help to build that. Obviously, there was at that point no audio, and not obviously, but at that point there was no audio, there was no video. The consulting arm did not yet exist. But we both on the business and editorial side, and I was on edit at that time, we were holding hands and saying, this is about resilience. We need to build resilience in this business, and one way to do that is multiple revenue streams. So we wanted to deliver Atlantic style editorial content on whatever platforms our audiences would consume them, or wherever we could make money as well. So it's a very deliberate effort to have kind of a business resilience during the whole decade that I was there.
Good. And now on to The Economist, is another storied brand, where I'm guessing that part of your remit is to bring that same kind of brand elasticity to The Economist. And in fact, you've just now launched an executive education arm, which is really interesting. Tell me about that, and what it is about The Economist that makes that a good vehicle for that particular kind of product.
Yeah, so thanks for asking about that. We have launched education courses for executives, and it's a natural extension. It's a new product extension of our newsroom and of what we do. We have a long history at The Economist in the classroom. Our content shows up, on syllabi, and high school and college students are using it for coursework, and our journalists are lecturing and teaching. And that's not unusual for maybe a premium brand. But we looked around and see this burgeoning online market for executive education,
Mm.
and the values of our journalism being analytical and rigorous and trustworthy, fair-minded, all of that lends itself to bringing a different version of our journalism, sliced and diced differently, repackaged differently, for an executive audience that is either wants to or needs to know more on whatever the topic of these classes, which are typically going to be 6 to 8 weeks. So the first class is called Navigating the New Global Order: Business, Politics, and Tech in a Changing World. And our that's right in our sweet spot. Helping understand geopolitics is one of the things that makes us somewhat unique in the marketplace relative to a lot of our excellent competitors, is that we take a real global perspective on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so to bring that kind of a geopolitical analysis into this course, big experiment, but we got more signups than we hoped for, and we're launching the second presentation of that course, I think in August, and we have a second new course that we're going to launch in September, which is about how to write for business, professional writing, where we actually can also bring some expertise. And I think we will wait and see, but I think this could be a growing. It's going to be small at first, but a growing extension of what The Economist does, and a growing business line. So it's fun to be in the invention mode. Obviously, as you know, so much of these jobs is execution, is day-to-day bread and butter execution. But to keep the innovation going at the same time is essential, or you won't change with the times, and you won't attract new audiences.
How did you come up with those particular topics to focus on?
We started with what we thought was core to our brand, to our newsroom, what we're good at, what we're known for, where we have special expertise. And then we did some market research to see whether those were topics for that would have nice uptake at the audiences we were aimed for, which is mid-level and senior professionals, executives who are either looking for a career boost or just to expand their own horizons.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, good luck with that, Bob.
Thanks.
That's the kind of resilience that the industry needs, and I like your framing it as sort of journalism by another means. And it's great The Economist has the trust of its audience to branch out like that. Trust, however, is is a rare commodity in our industry these days. Throughout the course of your career and mine, we've seen trust erode. But the industry that used to be the source of truth for so many Americans is now, considered, at the sort of nadir of its representation, an enemy of the people. Just to kind of to bring it back to the stuff that is in our control, do you think in any way that we have contributed to that decline? We as professional journalists have contributed to that decline in trust?
Yes, I'm sure we have. But first, a tiny bit of what I would call late-breaking good news on the front of your question. The Reuters digital news report is out today, and what Reuters, which is an annual digital news report, as you know, that looks at the state of digital news, and the percent of people who say they trust journalism most of the time went up from 38 to 44% in year over year. Which, we are now operating in an industry that has 44% trust, but I suppose that's better than one that has 38% trust.
Yes.
And so I think that's and I think the analysis, which I haven't dug into, is it's on the back of coverage of COVID, which tells me what I think we all knew, which is in a moment when consumers, when audiences are hungry to understand something, and it's urgent in their lives, and there are confusing kind of cross currents of information, that we play an essential role in helping them. And that's why so many of us saw rising audiences, rising subscriptions during over the last year, even as other aspects of the business may have been more troubled by kind of a COVID recession. But I think what we learned at The Economist, and I'm sure others did as well, is being rigorous and trustworthy and based on analysis and fact checked and fair minded made us a magnet for people who needed to understand what was going on in the world, and being global, having a global perspective as well. So that gives me hope that for those brands that stick to their guns, that stick to their values, or that start up new with these kinds of values, there is demand. People will pay, and there is a future. But there's no doubt, to go to the core of your question, that we all contributed. The industry broadly, I think, contributed to the decay of trust. Whether it was falling victim to disinformation and misinformation, whether it was falling victim to kind of clickbait and shallowness and not keeping our eye on the things that really matter to people, chasing the next page view and serving a pop-up ad next to it was no way to build long-term trust or to build a long-term business. And I'm happy to say that I have not been obligated to work in those environments over the course of my career, because I don't think that would be a gratifying experience.
Let me ask you about the future. You've painted an optimistic portrait of your faith that people who practice our profession with rigor and integrity will eventually, triumph in the end. And I hope that's right. Does media have a role in bridging the divide between the political sides, the polarization that now grips most of the country? And what is that role?
Well, we helped to create it. We probably ought to help to fix it, right? I do think we have a role, but it's really the same. Media is a monolithic term. Some media contributed to that problem, and some publications, some media operations can be the antidote to that problem. And it's those of us like yours and mine and other places we both have worked that stick to the values of analysis and rigor and fact checking and fair mindedness. But also there's a business model question here too, which there are plenty of places that do that, but have we all made a bet on advertising as a business model. We all did that years ago, unless you're brand new, unless you're the information and just started 5 years ago and we're all in on subscriptions. The question has been, who had the foresight and the wherewithal and the strength to migrate away from that model, and was willing to invest in a B2C, in a consumer model, and not just an advertising model. You can have all the editorial values you want in the world, but if you have no revenue coming in because you're relying on advertising and Google and Facebook just ate your lunch, then you're going to be out of luck. And at the Atlantic, when I was there, we were embarked on this migration from an advertising model to a better consumer model. We had print subscriptions, but not yet digital subscriptions until my last year there. I came to The Economist, and one of the many attractions was a thriving B2C, a thriving consumer business, which is to say subscriptions. And we are less reliant on the vagaries of the advertising market, and when you are serving your customer with great journalism, you're also serving your business at the same time, because those customers who are consuming the great journalism are paying you for it directly, and you're not selling their eyeballs through a kind of a bank shot through advertising. Now, we still do that, and my ad sales team don't want to hear me say otherwise. Of course, we still do that at The Economist, but it's not the preponderance of the revenue.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, Bob, let's leave it there. I think sort of a great takeaway if I can lightly paraphrase what you said, is that with rigor and integrity, telling the truth and having a good paywall will set you free.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to be
All
with
right.
you.
Thank you. This was fun. Thanks very much. This has been The Human Factor, the LinkedIn Live of Inc. and Fast Company. I'm Eric Schoenberg. Thanks for watching.